Here's our manual. So just a quick overview of what we'll be covering in this training course. So we've got 7 main sections actually. Let me find the course overview here. There we are. So we've got an introduction to FME Server. So we'll just cover what FME Server is all about and the basics of how to work with it. Then we'll look at data handling and FME Server. So we'll look at how to get your data sets up into FME Server to make them available to the workspaces you've created. We'll look at self-serve basics, so how to create workspaces and structure them in a way that when your end users go to run these on FME Server, they have full access to be able to get access to their own data sets or upload their own data for processing. We'll also look at real-time with FME Server, so being able to deal with messages in real time. So if somebody's sending an email to FME Server, you can have your workflows automated based on certain activities that happen outside of FME Server. We've also got real-time message handling, so that's dealing with message streams. So that's dealing with large amounts of data all coming through at once. And then finally, we'll look at some advanced server workflows, so just different ways to structure your workflows to have better control over exactly how workspaces run on the server. So the structure of this course, so we'll be going over 5 days for this week. Each day we'll be doing 2 hours of training. So we'll be going from 9 to 11 Pacific time. In the middle of each day, we'll be taking about a 10-minute break just to give you a chance to stretch your legs. Yeah, that's about it for the structure. So some prerequisites for this training. We do assume that you have some prior knowledge of working with FME Workbench, at least to the extent that's covered by the desktop tutorial. So I think I'll take this opportunity to do another quick poll here. Can you please raise your hand if you have taken the FME desktop tutorial training, so you have some experience with FME? All right, that's looking good. I see a couple hands not raised, so if you have no experience, we will take it slow, but just bear in mind we will be assuming that you have some basic idea of how FME works, but we're not going to be doing anything too crazy in this training course either. Fantastic. Okay. So I'm running this course from an EC2 instance, so everything that I'm doing on this machine should be available to you if you're following along on an EC2. So everything should be set up in exactly the same way, just to make it easier for you to follow along. So some course resources. So on these training machines, we have installed everything that you will need to be able to follow along with all the exercises here. So we've got an installation of FME Desktop 2019, as well as FME Server 2019, a few additional things that we won't actually be using for this course, but it's available. So we've got a SQL Server installed on here as well. All of the data that you need for this training course is installed on this machine as well. So it's all located on the C drive under a folder called FME Data 2019. So I can open that up just to show you where that is. There's a shortcut under Quick Access if you need that. So you can click on there to go straight to the FME Data 2019 folder. And this will have all of the workspaces and data sets that we'll need for all of the exercises that we'll be covering over the next few days. Yeah, so that's everything that you need for the course. At this stage, are there any questions? Is anyone having any difficulty finding anything you need or logging into your EC2 machines? I'll give a minute for anyone to type in if you need it. So we had a request for the link to the Git book. So Ryan just sent that out through the chat. So you should have that now. Okay, and again, if you do need to access that again, I think it should be in the email that you would have been sent about this course. If you go to the course resources page on our community You'll find the links to all the training manuals in there as well. Okay, so with that, let's get going into the training. So let's get going with Chapter 1, and we'll just do a brief introduction to FME Server. So FME Server is a product that basically lets you take all of the workspaces that you've created on FME Desktop and push them up to an enterprise environment and provide you with many different tools to help you automate how your data is converted and connecting different applications together that may not otherwise be able to speak to each other. So for this chapter, we're just going to be introducing FME Server, its interface, and how workspaces in FME Desktop can connect to workspaces on FME Server. So what is FME Server? So as I'd mentioned, it's a product for being able to take your data up to the enterprise level. So Server has 3 core capabilities when we discuss it. The first one is self-serve. So FME Server provides the ability for an end user to be able to select and download any data that they need in the format or structure that they'd require, or to be able to upload their own data sets for processing. So it basically helps to eliminate the need to manually run, say, a workspace on FME Desktop every time somebody needs an updated version of a particular data set. So you can create workspaces, push them up to FME Server, and FME Server provides an interface where those who may not otherwise have access to FME or understanding how to run the workspaces are able to log into a web interface where they can select a few options and get exactly what they need and process the data they need when they need it without having to go and request somebody to do that for them. Another capability we'll talk about during this training is real time. So that's FME Server's ability to react to real-time events and sensors. So being able to create or to make updates immediately as soon as new data is created or has been made available. So it kind of ties into the third capability, which is automation. So that's being able to carry out data processing on a specific schedule or automatically as soon as the data is made available. So with automation, you could have someone, for example, send an email to FME Server with a data set attached and have FME Server automatically take that data and maybe do some validation on it and import it into your existing database. Or you could have FME Server sitting there watching a particular directory, and then anytime a data set has been updated, you can have a series of processes run in response to that to automatically handle that data and handle those changes. So FME Server versus FME Desktop. So basically, FME Server expands on the processing power of FME Desktop. So both tools provide the same core data translation and transformation abilities. So what we call the FME engine is the same in both desktop and server. And the FME engine is the piece that actually does all of the work. So it is able to read data in a bunch of different forms, handle all the data transformation tools, handle all the transformers in there, and create the output that you've created within your workspace. So when you create a workspace on desktop and publish that up to FME Server, it will run in exactly the same way. What Server adds is a whole set of different tools to be able to automate and manage those jobs in a much more intuitive way. FME Server itself does not provide an authoring tool, so you do still need to have FME Desktop in order to create workspaces that you would publish to Server. So the two products work hand in hand. So Desktop is a requirement for Server. So the focus of the course today will be looking at how to create and how to author workspaces in ways to help take full advantage of FME Server's enterprise capabilities. So move on to the next section here. So we'll look at FME Server Roles. So basically, as we go through this course, we'll be discussing different kinds of roles or basically different kinds of people who would be accessing FME Server. So we'll just define those here just so we have a reference for later when we start talking about an author versus a user and so on. So when we discuss the concept of an author, this is a person who has access to both FME Desktop and FME Server. This is the person who'd be creating the workspaces or translations using desktop and then publishing that to FME Server and configuring any automation or anything like that within the server environment. So for this training course, we'll be focusing on the role of the author. So we're assuming that you're all going to be eventually going to be the authors who'll be creating the workspaces and pushing them up to FME Server and setting those up to run in some way. So typically an author would be someone who's an experienced FME desktop user who has a good understanding of readers and writers, transformers, and other FME desktop functionality. This person would also have a good idea of how FME Server works in order to be able to create workspaces that function very well on the server environment. So the next role we'll look at is the user. So the user is defined as a person who would be accessing data using FME Server services. So this person doesn't necessarily have to have any knowledge of FME Desktop or have really any idea of how they work or why they need them. All this person needs to do is to know what kind of data they need and what kind of processes they want to be able to run. So this user might be someone, for example, like a CAD operator who wants to check out spatial data from the centralized database, and they'd like to have an interface that they can log into, click a few buttons, and get the data they need when they want it. So this person doesn't have to know anything about FME. They just need to know where to go to click the buttons to get the data that they need. Another user that we discussed through this training course is the concept of a developer. So that's somebody who would be building applications that can submit jobs to FME Server and then handle the results. So we don't cover this too much in these training materials, but we do have another course called the FME Server REST API training course, which would be geared toward a developer who would be building an application that would talk to FME Server. So if you're interested in that kind of scenario or use case, definitely check out that training course. We ran it in the last 2 weeks, so we'll have recordings for that up pretty soon on our website. So if you're interested, you can check that out, view the recordings, and see the material there. The final user that we'll mention through this training is the FME Server Administrator. So this would be the person who's responsible for installing and maintaining FME Server and all its related services. So they'd be the person who'd be planning the system architecture, installing any applications that are required for the server to run, dealing with licensing and troubleshooting and just making sure everything's running smoothly and set up for all the other users to be able to access what they need on FME Server. So again, this one we won't be covering too much in this training course, but we will mention some administration tasks. We do have an FME Server Administrator training course that hasn't been run yet this year, which is coming up in a month or two, I think. I don't remember the exact dates, but that's on our training website. So if you're interested, it's in 2 weeks actually. So definitely check that out if you're interested in seeing that one. Okay, so back to our authoring training here. So we're just going to start just by discussing a few of the FME Server components that are relevant to you as an author. So we're not going to go too deep into the full architecture of FME Server, but there are a few key components that you do need to be aware of. So the first ones are the FME engines. So these are the pieces that actually carry out the transformation processing. We'll also look at the server core just to have an understanding that this is the piece that would handle queuing jobs, kicking off schedules, as well as managing load balancing on the server. So being able to push jobs to particular engines when those engines are free. And then finally, we'll look at the web services, which are the piece that handles requests that are made to FME Server. So the first thing here are the FME engines. So the engines process job requests on FME Server by running FME workspaces. So the engine, as I'd mentioned before, is the same core engine that runs jobs when you run them in FME Desktop. The difference in FME Server is, while in Desktop, one instance of Workbench can only have one engine, so you can only ever run one job at a time. In Server, you can have as many engines as you need. So you can have from 1 to however many has been installed by your server administrator. The more engines you have, the more jobs you can process simultaneously. So if you have one engine on your server and you submit 10 jobs, you'll see that the first job will go to the engine and start running, and the other 9 jobs will go into an FME server queue. And so they'll basically just line up and wait for the engine to be finished its first job before the next job starts to process. So they'll each go in order, one at a time. Now, if you have 10 engines and you submit 10 jobs, you'll see all 10 jobs run at the same time. So they'll all get an engine and they'll all run. So the number of engines you have on your server really corresponds to how many jobs or how much throughput you need on the server itself. So if you find you're submitting lots and lots of jobs and they tend to get queued up a lot, you might want to consider more engines. But if you've only got the one and you're okay with a little bit of a queue sometimes, that's totally fine as well. So it all depends on the volume of jobs that would be submitted. As an author, it's good for you to be aware of how many engines are available. So if you're creating lots and lots of jobs and you don't have enough engines to handle that, you might want to consider how you architect those jobs or how you make that work. So the FME Server Core, so this is the piece that handles those job requests. So that's the piece that'll actually take the jobs and send them to specific engines, depending on which engines are available. It'll also manage scheduling. So if you set up a job to run every day at midnight, it'll handle that. It'll also help manage repository contents. So this keeps track of all of the workspaces or custom formats, transformers, and data that have been published up to FME Server. And we'll look at how you publish that coming up. Yeah, so the Server Core also contains a software load balancer to distribute the jobs to the different engines. One thing you can do on the engines, and we'll see that when we go into the server web interface, is that you can set up what we call job queues. So you can you can reserve certain engines for certain kinds of jobs, and you can also set a priority on those queues. So if you have some jobs, maybe you have 10 jobs in your queue and you have one job that's coming in that's really important and needs to run right now, you can set that to a higher priority than the other jobs in the queue and have that kind of skip the line and go straight to the engine as soon as it's available. So you have lots of flexibility in how you set that up. And the final piece here are the web services. So these are the pieces that kind of handle communication between FME Server and different clients that would be connecting to it or interacting with it. Most common client you'd be using with FME Server is a web browser. So you'd be logging into the server web interface to submit jobs and manage data or anything up there. So there's quite a number of different services available on FME Server, and we'll be looking at these as we go through the course. But some examples here are data download or data streaming. So these are what we'd call transformation services that handle what FME Server does with the output of a workspace. So with data download, for example, it'll take the output from a workspace, stick it into a zip file and make that available through a URL. So you can click on the link to download the data and get it right away. So we'll look at each of these services as we go. So we'll see what each of those are for and where they can come in useful. All right, so let's look at the link between FME Workspaces and FME Server. So we say that FME Server has a model-driven architecture, which basically means its processes are expressed as models. Essentially what that means is you create a workspace, publish that to server, and FME Server uses that workspace as a way to define exactly what that job's going to be doing. So you create these workspaces using FME Desktop, using Workbench application. So you create the workspace, you can save that and publish that up to FME Server. So because Workbench and Server can kind of talk to each other like that, we would say that FME Workbench is a client of FME Server. So they can communicate and share data in both directions. Because FME Workbench is a client of FME Server, it can be used to transfer workspaces that you've created to FME Server. So we call that transfer publishing. So you take your workspace in Workbench and you publish that to FME Server. So the Workbench also has the ability to, so you can publish from there. You can also republish a workspace. So if you're creating a workspace and you publish it up to FME Server once just to test it out, and you find you need to make some changes in there, you can always republish straight from Workbench just to make that process easier. So you can keep updating the version of the workspace in FME Server, so you can kind of iteratively create that. The other option in Workbench is to be able to download a workspace. So you can pull any workspace down from FME Server. So if you need to make any changes or make any updates, you can do that. So repositories. So when you publish a workspace up to FME Server, the workspace will be stored in what we call a repository. So a repository basically acts like a folder in FME Server, and it just provides a way to organize how your workspaces are stored. So you can create multiple repositories and give them names specific to the kinds of tasks that the jobs inside them will be doing. So repository is made up of two pieces. So the first piece would be the FMW or workspace file that you've published up to FME Server. So that file is taken and stored in the file-based part of the repository. So FME Server has a copy of that workspace at that stage. The other piece is metadata. So FME Server also keeps track of information about the workspace, and it stores that separately in the FME Server database. So the metadata would include things like what's in the workspace, information about the readers in there, the writers, any published parameters or workspace feature types. So it keeps track of all of that information, so you know exactly what's in those workspaces, so you can take a look at those through the server web interface. So repositories themselves are managed by the FME Core, so that piece keeps track of the link between the workspace file and the metadata in the FME Server database. So let's take a look at how you publish a workspace now. So the functionality for being able to publish or download a workspace is accessed directly through FME Workbench, either through the menu bar. So you go to File and you'll see the three options: Publish, Download, and Republish. You can also access those through the toolbar at the top. So you'll have a Publish, Republish, and Download button inside there. It tends to be at the far right of the toolbar by default, but you can always rearrange those depending on how you use your toolbars. Connecting to FME Server. So when you do click on the Publish button, it'll bring up a wizard. First dialog of the wizard will let you define your connection to your FME Server. So you'd be creating a web connection to save your credentials, set up a connection name, put in the URL for your FME Server instance, and then your username and password. Once you authenticate, you'll be taken to the next dialog, which would be to select your repository. So this basically lets you select which folder you'd like to place your workspace in. So you can either choose an existing one or create a new repository as you're going. You can also give your workspace a new name if you'd like to rename it when you publish that up to FME Server. The next stage in the dialog would be a connections upload. So if you're using any database or web connections within your workspace, FME Server will give you the option to publish those connections up to FME, or the wizard will give you the option to publish those connections up to FME Server so that it's available up there, so the workspace will run the same way it did in Workbench. And then the last page of the dialog is the workspace registration page, which lets you register your workspace with any number of FME Server services. So don't worry too much about this at this stage, and we'll look through what each of these services does so you have a good understanding later on. In this case here, we're using the job submitter service, which just runs a job exactly as it is. So this is the one we'll be using to get going and to start testing workspaces in the FME server environment. After you've published a workspace up to FME Server, you'll see that the republish button becomes active. It's usually deactivated if there's no link between the current workspace in your current session and FME Server. Once you have the republish option available, you can make changes to your workspace and then upload those updates with a single click. Finally, downloading a workspace basically works in exactly the same way as publishing. You'd click on the Download from FME Server button, which will open a wizard. First button will let you set up your connection credentials so you can log into your FME server. The next dialog will then let you select your repository and the workspace you'd like to download. So you can then select that, decide where you want to save the copy of that workspace, and it opens immediately within FME Workbench. One thing to keep in mind is when you are downloading a workspace like that, you're downloading a copy of the workspace that's on FME Server. So if you download that and then make changes to the local copy, it won't affect the copy in FME Server until you publish those changes back to the server. Okay, enough talk for now. Let's get on to the first exercise. So we're going to start building up a workspace that we're going to publish up to FME Server, and we'll take a look at how all of this works together. So we're on exercise 1.1. If you have your EC2 instances and you're logged in, you're more than welcome to follow along. You're also welcome to follow along if you're using your own machines. So I'm just going to move my browser over a bit so I have some space to work. So I'll give you a second. So we're on exercise 1.1. That's in chapter 1 here. So we're going to look at the process of building a workspace and then publishing that up to FME Server. So for a lot of these exercises, we'll be taking on the role of a technical analyst in the GIS department of our local city. So we have plenty of experience with FME Desktop, and our department is now investigating FME Server and trying to see how it could possibly be of value. So one of your tasks for the purpose of this exercise is to take the data from a couple of different departments and merge it together into a single corporate database. So because each department produces their datasets in a different format and style, we're going to use FME to carry out this task, and then we want to schedule this so it happens automatically on a weekly basis. So for this exercise, we're going to have two datasets that we're bringing in. So one is for fire halls and one is for neighborhoods. So one's a GML file and the other one is a KML. So step one is to inspect the data, but we're going to use some tools in 2019 to inspect that differently. So we're going to skip that one for now. So we're going straight to step 2 in this training. So we're going to start up FME Workbench and then add our readers to connect to our data sets. So you can start up Workbench in a couple of different ways on these machines. We have a shortcut at the bottom here, so you can just click on the FME Workbench logo in the bottom toolbar in your machine. You could also go to the Start menu and select FME Workbench, or locate it here under FME Desktop, and then FME Workbench. So whatever you do, just choose an option and start up Workbench. There we go. Just resize a little bit here. There we go. So I'll give everyone a couple seconds just to get going. One thing I will mention, as it's come up in some of our other training courses, is that if you just started up your training instance this morning or fairly recently, you might find that the machine's a little bit slow at the beginning of the day. The more you use it, it will speed up more as well. So if it is a little bit slow to get going, it should speed up throughout the training course today. So perhaps be a little bit patient with that. I did find that with mine earlier today as well, and it's back to a reasonable state now. So now that we have Workbench open, we're going to start with a blank workspace. So I'm just going to click on the New button here to get going. And then let's go to Readers, and we're going to add our first reader. So say Readers, add reader. So our first data set will be here. So we'll be reading a GML data set. There we go. Adding a little bit of drama here with Workbench. Okay. So once you've selected GML as your format, we're going to select the data set. So the reader data set will be found at the location mentioned in the training manual. So it's in the C FME Data 2019 folder. So I'm going to click on the Browse button to go there. I'm going to use the quick access and go to FME Data 2019 from the sidebar. So that's just here on the left-hand side under FME Data 2019. Our data set's in the Data folder. And inside Emergency. The data set we're going to look at is called Fire Halls. So I'm going to double click to select that. Once your reader is set up, we can click OK to add in our first reader. So the workspace should look like this now. So you've got a single feature type with your Fire Halls data set and some information about the Fire Halls themselves. Next, we're going to add in our second reader. So we're going to connect to the KML data set. So let's go to Readers and add another reader. For format, let's select KML. There we go. And for data set, we'll select what's set here. So we'll go to the Browse button again. So we'll go to the Data folder. So FME Data 2019, Data. And this one's inside Boundaries. And the file we're looking for is called Vancouver Neighborhoods. And we'll select that and click OK to add in this reader. At this stage, we'll see a little pop-up asking us to select our feature types. We only want one feature type, so I'm going to uncheck Select All, and then check on one feature type for neighborhoods. So we just want the neighborhood information. We don't really care about all the KML specific information that we could bring into this workspace. So from Select Feature Types, we'll deselect, select all, and then check the neighborhoods feature type to bring that in. And click OK. So we should now have one workspace with two feature types like this. So what we can do now is inspect these data sets. So I'm going to click on each of these readers, and you'll see this little toolbar pops up at right above it. So I'm just going to click Run Just This. So I'll do that for my Fire Halls. And so this has imported a cached copy of that data. So I can now click on this little magnifying glass, and I can inspect this data using the visual preview window in Workbench. So my window's a little small, but you can kind of see what we've got here. So we've got 8 different features, and each of them is a point inside here. So I can see each of those points and I can inspect them directly within Workbench. So I know exactly what I'm working with and what kind of data is in here. I can now do the same for the neighborhoods feature type. So I'll just click on that, click on the little run button and run just that part. You'll see this unexpected input dialog pop up saying that it found some features and a few of the feature types within the KML file that we haven't imported into our workspace. That is completely normal. We did choose not to import this data because we don't want that, so we can click OK. So we can inspect this data set now and see what we've got. So we've got some polygon data in this case. So one thing about these two data sets, though, is that they're both in different coordinate systems. So we can confirm that from the visual preview. If you see this little set of icons on the left side of the visual preview window, there's a show hide feature information window. So I'm just going to click on that. And that'll bring up this feature information window, and that has the coordinate system information for my data set. So I can see here, if I select one of my neighborhoods, the coordinate system's LL84. But if I select my fire halls and select one of my points, I'll see the coordinate system is EPSG 26910. So it's WGS or UTM 83-10. So right from the start, I can see my two data sets aren't in the same coordinate system, but what I'd like to do is overlay these. So I'm going to need to do a bit of work to put those into the same coordinate space. So first thing we'll do here is add a reprojector transformer. So we're going to reproject the neighborhoods data set into the same coordinate system as the fire halls. So I'm just going to click onto the canvas here and type in reprojector to add that. Make sure it's connected to the neighborhoods reader. Then we can click on the cogwheel here to start configuring this transformer. So for source, we'll leave that at read from feature. And for destination, we're going to set that to the UTM 83-10. That matches the fire halls data set. So it should be configured like this. We can click OK to accept that change. So our final step here will be to add a writer into the workspace. For this, since we're just building up the very beginning of this workspace, we're not sure what we're going to be writing to just yet. So let's add in a dummy writer so we can configure that and get it working before we put in a real writer later on. So for the writer, let's go to Writers in Workbench, and we'll click on Add Writer. And for format, since we're adding a dummy writer, we'll just set this to null, which means it won't write anything. Under feature type definition, make sure that's set to copy from reader. It should be like that by default. And we can click OK. When it asks us which feature types we'd like to add, we're going to add both. So we'd like to add 2 writer feature types, one for fire halls and one for neighborhoods. So we'll click OK to add those in. So our workspace should look like this, and it should match what we see in the exercise here. Next thing we'd like to do is add a clipper transformer. So we're going to be dividing our fire halls data by neighborhoods. So we're going to use a clipper to find which fire halls fall within which neighborhoods. So let's place a clipper transformer. Drop that into the canvas. And what we'd like to do is take the fire halls data and send that to the clip E port. So send that to the bottom input port. So firehauls goes into clip E, and then we'll take the reprojector output and send that to clip ER. So we're going to be clipping the firehall data by the neighborhood data. So your connection should look like this. You'll have them crossed, firehauls going to the bottom and reprojector going to the top. If you want to, you can right click on the input ports to reorder them. So I can move clip E up just so they're not crossed over like that. The next thing we want to do is configure one of the options inside the clipper transformer. So let's click on the parameters button. And we're going to enable merge attributes. So down at the very bottom, you'll see this checkbox beside merge attributes. You can click on that to enable that. Once you've enabled that, click OK. And then we'll connect our clipper to our outputs. So the inside output port should now get connected to firehauls. So the inside will be all of the points that fell within each of the different neighborhoods from our neighborhood data set. And then we'd also like to keep a copy of our neighborhoods data. So we're going to take the output from the reprojector and send that to the neighborhoods output on the writer. So your workspace should look like this. Reprojector should be connected to the clipper as well as the writer, and inside should be connected to firehauls. And our final step here will be to configure this so we create a different firehall feature type for each of the different neighborhoods. So we're going to open up the feature type parameters on our writer. I see a quick question. Maybe I did part of this a little fast. Somebody's asking about switching the two ports on the clipper. So you just right click on the transformer, so right click on the input ports or near them, and you have this move up and move down option. Okay, so on the writer, let's open up the feature types, and we're going to adjust the feature type name. So right now it's hard-coded to firehauls, and we'd like this to change based on the neighborhood name. So from the training manual, you can copy the value from there and paste that in. Oops, that is not it. Maybe that's not copying. Nope. All right, so we can type that in. So I'm going to say firehauls. One option here is to click this drop-down arrow and open the text editor. And from here, I can add values from the different attributes in my data set. That way I can avoid potential typos. So put firehauls, dash, and then I want the neighborhood name. So that's listed here. So from the top, if I open up FME feature attributes, I can locate neighborhood name, and I can just double click to add that. And that'll put that in using the correct syntax. Alternatively, I could have just typed in @value neighborhood name if I'd wanted to. I find this is a little bit easier just to make sure you don't misspell something in there. I tend to do that myself. So at this point, make sure your feature type name is firehauls @value neighborhood name. Once you've made the change, click OK. First of all, let's save our workspace now so we have a backup of this. So go to File and Save. You can save that wherever you want. I'll just leave it going to the default location in my documents. We'll call this Exercise 1. Or you can give that a name that means something to you so you can remember it for later. I'll click Save. The next step here will be to test the workspace to make sure it runs. So it's always a good idea to test your workspaces using FME Workbench before you publish them to server, just to make sure everything is working correctly when you do bring those over to server. So click on the Run button. And you should see your output like this. You should see have about 14 different features written. And in the features written summary, you should see fire halls dash neighborhood name for each of the different neighborhoods from the Vancouver dataset. So I'll do a quick show of hands. You just put the hands down first. Was everyone able to run that successfully? You raise your hand if you could, if it worked. Okay, that looks good. Perfect. So I think that was basically everyone, so that's good. Again, if you do have any problems, just ask us through the questions panel. We're happy to help you out. So our next step here, now that we have a working workspace, is to publish this up to FME Server. So to do that, let's go to the File menu in Workbench. And then we'll go to File, and then we'll click Publish to FME Server. And the first thing we'll do is create a new web connection to connect to the FME servers on our training machines. So from Connection, you can click the drop down, and we'll say Add Web Connection. So we can click on that. So you can give our connection a name. I tend to call this Training on the Training Machines. Next, we want to set the server URL. Because FME Server is running on the same machine where our workbench is, we can just set the URL to localhost. So make sure that's HTTP localhost. So it'll just connect directly to the local machine. The next step here is to set a username and a password. So our username is going to be admin, and the password will be the same. It'll just be admin, all lowercase. Once you've set that up, you can click on Authenticate to test the connection. And you should see it successfully authenticate. Once you're authenticated with your server, you can click on the Next button. And this will let us select the repository that we're going to publish our workspace to. So you can see by default, there's a few different repositories already created on these FME servers. So we have some for samples and tools and so on. For our training, we're going to create a new repository, and we're going to place our workspace in there. So I'm going to click on the New button here. For repository name, we'll set this to Training. We can give it a description if we wanted to. I'll just set that for storing training workspaces. We'll click OK. And that will create our training repository, and we should select that by default. For the workspace name, it'll default to the name that we saved our workspace with. I'll keep it that way. You'll see here at the very bottom, we've got this Upload Data Files option. We're going to check that on. So we'd like to make our two data sets available on FME Server so our workspace can run. So check that. And you should see that it automatically selects 3 files. So FME will check our workspace and see that there's 3 input files being used for our 2 readers. If you want to see which files it's going to include, you can click on Select Files. And this will show you exactly what it's going to be uploading to the server when it publishes the workspace. And you can see the reason there's 3 files because the GML also has an XSD kind of sidecar file with it. So that looks good. We can click Next. And then finally, we can select which services we'd like to register with. So we'll just keep the job submitter service selected by default. And when you're ready, you can click Publish. So you should see down here at the bottom in your translation log that this workspace was successfully published. So we've got our published summary, and it shows us which the workspace that was uploaded, where it went, and it provides us with a direct link to go and access that on FME Server. This is less good. Okay. So we did see that it was published before we lost Workbench there, so we did publish. That was a bit strange. So hopefully these machines will cooperate with us. I think sometimes these training machines have some funny things going on them. Okay, so let's do a quick show of hands now. Can you just raise your hand if you were able to successfully publish? Fantastic. And then we'll do one more show of hands after this. Does anyone need a few more minutes to publish their workspace? Perfect. So I don't see any hands here. Yeah, see a few people also had that crash happen after publishing. Yeah, I think there is something on these machines that's causing that. So sorry for that trouble. It's a weird one. It's not a common thing outside of these training machines, so not really sure what's causing that. So we just finished off exercise 1.1 and we published a workspace up to FME Server. So let's look at a few bits of theory before we move on to an exercise where we look at the FME Server web interface. So I'll just give you a brief introduction and a brief overview, and then we'll look at some practical ways of interacting with it. So the server web interface is accessed through a URL like the one shown here. So to be your server name, the port that it's installed on, /FME Server. You can access it through the Start menu. If you go to Start, FME Server, and you'll see FME Server Web Interface as an option there. The other thing you can do is just type in the name of your server host directly in a web browser and go straight there. The web interface will look something like this when you log in. So you've got your home page, and there'll be, by default, there's 6 different panels with quick links to different parts of the server interface that would be potentially useful for you to interact with. So the first one here is Help. So you have access to the documentation for the FME Server interface. You have a link to the FME community. So if you're on here and you find you have a question or there's some kind of workflow you'd like to put together, but you're not quite sure how to start, the community is a great place to look for resources and ask any questions you might have. We have a link to our demos page as well if you want to see some of the things that are possible with FME Server. There's a link to the server tour, so if you really want just to get the basics and figure out where to get started, that's a great starting point. And then a link to our training courses, as well as a link to the REST API documentation. You'll also have your recent jobs, so if you'll see anything that you'd recently run or interacted with listed here with the status of that job, if it's still running or if it's completed successfully or if it failed. You'll also see your last published workspaces, so anything you published recently will be listed here. You can favorite workspaces, so if there's a few that you tend to come into the interface to run yourself, you can star those and access them from your favorites menu. You have recent projects, which we'll look at what those are coming up, as well as recent automations, which is also coming up in the trainings. We'll see how those work, but you can access anything that you've been kind of working with recently directly through those. One thing that's nice about this page is that it is customizable, so you can edit this and choose which of these panels you'd like to have displayed, and you can change the order of those. Another key feature in the web interface is the menu, so that's on the left-hand side here. And this gives you links to access the different parts of the server functionality. So at the very top, you've got a set of items that would relate to you as an author more specifically. So you can go in here to run a workspace, check on jobs, create your automations or schedule jobs, look at what's stored inside your repositories, use your workspace viewer, see notifications, resources. So these are different files that have been uploaded to FME Server. You've got connections, so connections to your web services or databases that you've published to the server, projects that you've created, as well as dashboards, just showing the overall health and show the status of different things on the system. In the bottom of the web interface, that's down here, you'll have the admin section. So depending on how your server is configured, or how your security system, or how security on your server has been configured by the administrator, you may or may not have access to this admin panel. We will for this training course because we're logging in as an administrator, but we'll be able to access things like the engines and licensing page, manage security, deal with system cleanup, backups, configuration, and other things. We're not going to cover too much of this in this training. This is covered in the administrator training course. So automations is brand new for FME 2019, and we'll have a whole chapter dedicated to exactly how these work. These basically replace the old notifications in the past. So if you've worked with older versions of Server and you've worked on automating things, you probably would have used the older interface called notifications. Automations provides the same functionality. It just provides a graphical user interface for being able to create the automations that you're building. So being able to set up ways for FME Server to receive and send emails, for example, and interact with other systems. So there's a few additional menus as well that you'll see in the top right part of the interface. So you'll see a little question mark with additional links for help. And you can click on your little user icon to access your user-specific settings. So you can change your password or update your email, reset your preferences, and manage any tokens you've created. We'll see what those mean coming up. And you can also enable dark mode on your interface. So manage tokens has been redone in 2019. In the past, one user could only have or create one token. Now you can actually have multiple tokens associated with your user account. What those tokens are for is they basically provide a way to authenticate with FME Server without needing to log in. So all you need to do is provide the security token to authenticate with it. This is really useful when you're interacting with something like the REST API in FME Server, and we'll cover that in the REST API training course. But we'll also see an instance here as an author where these tokens come in handy, and we'll be covering that coming up. Engines and licensing. This is an interesting page. As an author, it's good for you to be aware of how the engines and the queues function, but you may not actually have access to this depending on how locked down your system is when it's installed in your environment. When you go to that page, you'll see something like this if you have access to it. At the very top, you'll have your licensing section, which will indicate whether or not your machine has been licensed, as well as the number of engines that you're allowed to run on your system. And then down below, you'll have a list of all of the active engines, and you'll see which queues they've been associated with. So we'll head down for more details here. So licensing just lets you set up how many engines are started on your server. The engines just show you which engines are currently running and where they're running. So you'll actually see if you have engines installed on different machines and they're connected to the central core, you'll see that they're connected from different hosts and potentially different platforms. So sometimes people will have a mix of 32 and 64-bit engines depending on their needs and such like that. You'll also see a list of all the hosts for the engines if there's more than one. And then down here is the job queue section, which is I think the most important one for an author. This lets you define how you can reserve engines for specific types of jobs. So in this example, there's 2 queues. So we've got our default queue, which is basically the default for all the jobs that'll get submitted to any of the engines. And then here we've created a custom queue called quick jobs and here you can see we've assigned a specific engine for these jobs and a specific repository. So based on the setup for this, any job run from the training repository would automatically go to engine 1 with a priority of 1, which makes it a high priority job. So it'll always skip the queue if there's other jobs being submitted, and it'll run on a dedicated engine for that. So running a workspace. So we'll start a bit of a tour of the web interface at the Run Workspace page. When you click on that, you'll come to a page that looks like this, where you can select your repository and the workspace you'd like to run. You'll also see down below when you select your workspace that there'll be a list of any published parameters that are associated with that workspace. So you can set values for each of these before you run your workspace, before you run your job. The published parameters shown here would correspond to the published parameters that were defined within your workspace. So in this example here, I'm just bringing up my workspace from before. This one has 2 published parameters. So when we go to run this in the web interface, we'll be able to set values for both of these parameters when we run these in server as well. So published parameters provide a good way for your end users to be able to adjust exactly what a workspace is doing without having to install Workbench for themselves to modify the workspaces. Down below the published parameters, you'll see this advanced section. And there'll be a set of advanced parameters that define or basically fine-tune how the workspace will run. So you could set a job queue directly in here. So if you wanted one specific job to go to a specific queue, you could select from all of the queues that have been created from this. We also have things to control how the job runs. So the queue job expiry time. This will tell FME Server that if this job waits for more than this time, so more than whatever you set it, maybe 10 seconds, if it waits in the queue for too long and it goes beyond that time, that job will not run. It'll automatically be canceled. So this is useful if a job will get stale if it waits too long in the queue. Say, for example, you've got a database update that runs every day. If it waits in the queue for more than 24 hours, you probably don't want that to run because you've got another job with more fresh data coming up. So you can cancel that automatically to prevent problems. The other thing here is the running job expiry time. So you can set this up so that if a job takes longer than the expected amount of time to run, you can have FME Server automatically cancel that as well. So this will sometimes happen, particularly with databases. If something goes wrong on the network while the job's running, sometimes these jobs can kind of get into a hanging state and they'll run for a really long time and take up an engine without actually being able to do anything because they've lost the connection to the database or something. Usually it's something funny on the network where it thinks it's connected to the database, but it isn't really, so it's not doing anything. Sometimes another use for this would be if you've got, say, a small job that you expect small amounts of data to run with. Sometimes you might have a user who uploads the wrong kind of data for it, and maybe instead of uploading 10 features, they upload 10 billion features and the job runs for hours and hours. You can have it automatically cancel just in case something like that happens. So when you click on the Run button, when you run a job, you'll see a page like this, just saying your job has been submitted and will continue to run. Then when the job completes, you'll see a status page like this. So it'll give you the job ID, a summary of the amount of data that was written, and a link to view details for that job. So you can go and check on the job log and see exactly what happened. So the jobs page, which is listed right below Run Workspace in the server interface, is another useful place. From here, you can view any completed, queued, or running jobs on the system. So it's a good way just to see exactly what's happening. So you can check to see how many jobs are currently waiting in the queue, how many are currently running, and how many have finished. So this is really useful if you want to come and check on a job that you had running automatically or something like that. You can come to the completed page and see a list of all the jobs that have been run on FME Server. You can see at a glance what their status was, what time they finished. You can see their source type. So if it was automatically run on a schedule, you'll be able to confirm that. Jobs that were run manually will have an empty source type like this. And you'll see the status will be different depending on what happened with that job. So you'll have different icons for a failed job versus a canceled job, and so on. At the very top here, you can click on filters, and that'll allow you to filter your by different information about the job. So if you're looking for a specific job that ran 2 weeks ago, instead of having to page through all of the different jobs that have run on the server since, you can just filter by that job based on status, by your user, the engine it ran on, whatever it is that would help you find that better. When you click on a completed job, you'll be able to see additional information about its status. So in here, you'll see under completed, you'll have status, request data, as well as result data. So you can open each of those and see exactly what published parameter values were set when the job was run, as well as other information about them, how long they waited in the queue before they were submitted, and so on. And down below, you'll have access to the log file itself. So you'll also have similar pages for the queued and running jobs with information about how the job was submitted and how long it's been sitting there. Okay, so enough talk, let's get into some exercises. So we've got a few exercises that we'll do in quick succession here. So the first one will be exercise 1.2, and we're going to run the workspace that we published in our last exercise. So first step is to connect to FME Server. So there's a couple different ways to go to the server web interface. I think the easiest is just to open up a new tab in your web browser. So you can open up Chrome, which is pinned down at the bottom if you'd like. I'm starting with a blank tab, and I'll just type in localhost to connect. You'll see that it automatically redirects to point to the FME Server endpoint, which is exactly what we'd expect. Once you're there, you can log in with the username admin, password admin. If it's saved for you automatically, you can try that as well. It might work. So lowercase admin for the user, lowercase admin for the password. So I'm just going to move my tab over to the side here so I can see my instructions as well. So I'll give everyone a second. Just let us know if you have any trouble accessing anything on the server interface. Perfect. So when you log in, it'll take you straight to the home page like this. You'll see all those different boxes that I was talking about with your recent projects and so on. You can customize your home if you click on this cogwheel, and you can add different columns if you'd like, or rearrange them as needed. I'll just leave them as they are. I think you can rearrange clicking the Organize button at the top if you prefer certain ones to be there. So you can see up in the top here as well, you've got your user preferences. So you can click on that. You can reset the preferences. So what this will do is reset anything that you've customized in the interface, like your column layouts or anything like that. You can also enable dark mode if you'd prefer that for the training. I'll use the regular mode because the dark mode's a little hard to see on these training machines sometimes. But you can flip that on and off automatically if you'd like, or as you'd prefer. You can also see the side menu here with access to everything you need for authoring, as well as the administration section. So we should see under last published workspaces, you'll see your exercise 1 here published about 27 or so minutes ago. You can also click the star to favorite that, and you can have it listed in your favorite workspaces. First thing we'll do on these machines is just double check that we have some engines in which to run our job. So from the admin section, we can go to engines and licensing, and we'll just click on configure. We'll just see what we're working with here. So you should see your server is licensed. You'll see a green checkbox if that's true. You'll have 10 engines available, and currently we only have 2 started up. That's completely fine for the training. You could choose to switch this to 10 if you'd like to have all 10 running, but that's definitely overkill for what we're going to be doing over the next few days. Down here is where we could create queues if we wanted to set up some job queues as well. We're not going to be doing that today. So just let us know through the questions panel if you see anything funny in this page, if your server is not licensed or anything seems to be wrong, or if it's missing engines that you'd expect, just let us know. We'll make sure you're up and running. Now that we've confirmed that our servers are in good shape, let's go to run our workspace. So there's a couple ways we can do this. So one, we could just use the shortcut from our homepage. So if you ever want to get back to your homepage, you can just click on the FME server icon in the top left, and that'll take you straight back. So we can access that from favorite workspaces. We could also just say run workspace from here and manually select our repository and workspace. So repository, let's set that to training. And for workspace, it should automatically select the one workspace that's in there, which would be the one that you published. So just double check that matches the name that you'd expect. Under service, it'll automatically select job submitter because that's the only service we've got available right now. When we published our workspace, that's the only one we selected. And then down below, we have 2 published parameters. One is for the source date GML, and one is for the source KML files. You'll see by default, they're both pointing to FME MF dir. This macro basically tells FME that we publish these files with the workspace when we publish them up to FME Server, so it knows to find them in the same location that the workspace itself is stored in. So if you see this, that simply means the dataset was published with the workspace and it'll be looking for it there. If we wanted to, we could choose to upload these files ourselves just by clicking on the Browse button and uploading those directly to Server. But we'll be covering exactly how that works in Chapter 2. So just leave these as defaults and click on Run. And you should see your job will be submitted and continue to run. You should see it should have completed successfully with 14 features written. Let's do a quick show of hands. Did everyone see that complete successfully? Can you raise your hand if so? Okay, looking good. Do one more show of hands since that wasn't as many people as I'd expected. Can you raise your hand if you need a couple more minutes on this exercise? Okay, so for those who do need some extra time, if you do need any help, just let us know through the questions panel. Yeah, we can stop for a couple minutes just to make sure you're up to date there. Just raise your hand when you, or I guess just send us a question when you're ready to move on to the next. And while we're waiting, if anyone does have any questions about anything we've covered so far, definitely feel free to ask that as well. I'm happy to cover something while we're waiting a few extra minutes for this exercise. I see one question regarding a trial license. So they're asking about the maximum number of engines for that. Yeah, so if you do request an FME Server trial license, you'll get 2 engines by default for that one. So that is expected. So you can only have 2 engines with a trial license. That's managed through that configure button. You'll see exactly what your license allows you to have in here. At the very top under max engines. So that'll be the number you can actually use. I'll just give it another minute or 2 for people there. One thing I'll also mention as we go through this training, eventually we'll start to see that maybe your job IDs will be different than the job IDs that I'm seeing in my FME server. The job ID doesn't really matter that much. You'll see it change just depending on the number of jobs that have been run. So if I ran this job 3 times, I'd end up with a higher job ID. So you'll see that be different between some of the runs. So don't worry if that doesn't quite match up with what you've got on your own server. As long as the jobs run, that's all good. Just had another question on the number of engines. So that is dictated by the trial license, so by the license that you have. So with the trial, it's by default you get 2. If you purchase a license, you get to decide how many engines you'd like included with that. There's a cost per engine. So depending on how many engines you buy, that's how many engines you'd be able to start up. Oops. Okay, so I think that's pretty good. So we're going to continue to move on. So now that we've run our job and we've had it complete successfully, let's click on the View Details button. So we should see the full details about this job that was run on our server. Down at the bottom, we can see the log file. This will match up with exactly what you'd see when you run the job in desktop, so in that log window. At the top here, you have some filters. So if you just want to filter for errors, to check on any error messages. You can also filter on warnings if there were any. So we've got a couple in this case. And you can also filter for the different types. You can also show timestamps, which is useful if you're checking on how long it's taking for a workspace to run. And sometimes I find it's nice to show the log in reversed order so you can see the very bottom at the beginning. Some other useful things in here is you've got your job status information. So this has full details on exactly what happened with this job. So you can see what time it was submitted, when it went to the queue, when it started, finished, and when the results were delivered. These should all be pretty close to the same time because this was a very simple workspace and there's nothing else happening on our servers. For request data, this will be where you can check on the values for your published parameters. So you can see exactly what value was set when you ran your job. This is useful, especially if you're seeing error messages related to the source data set. You can come in here and see what the value was set to when it came through. You can also see information about some of those advanced parameters, so you can see what those were set to. And under result data, you'll just have additional information about the number of features that were written, as well as the status of your translation. All right. So that brings us to the end of that exercise. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next section here. So we've created our workspace, we've published this up to FME Server. Now we've realized that maybe we want to make some changes to this. So we're currently writing out to a null writer, which isn't doing anything at all. So we'd like to modify our workspace and upload a new version of it. As we're going, we'd like to be able to checkpoint the status of our, or the checkpoint our jobs. So like right now we have a job that's running and it's not throwing any error messages. So we want to make sure we have a copy of that so that when we make our updates, we don't lose this version of our workspace. So we can create new versions and submit those to server. So we have functionality for version control within FME Server. So this is useful as an author. So you can basically checkpoint versions of a workspace. So as you make changes, you can always revert to an older version if something went horribly wrong in an update. So version control would be configured by the FME Server administrator. And it's covered in detail in the server administrator training there. But we'll show you how to switch that on simply as an author right now, just so we can turn it on for our instances and show how version control affects the authoring experience. So the options for version control are found in system configuration. So that's down in the admin section in server. I'll just show you for now. We'll have an exercise coming up where we'll do this together. So don't worry about following along too much right now. So I'm in system configuration in general. And there's this version control section here. So it's just a little button I can switch on. I also have these options for remote settings. So if I had a remote GitHub repository that I wanted to push my version control history to, I could connect to that through here and then push and fetch from that remote repository. For this training, we're not going to be doing that because we're not going to set up GitHub accounts for everyone and get into that. But we will switch on the basic version control right now, which just saves a version locally on the FME server system. Once version control is turned on, you'll see a couple changes in the server interface. So one thing I'll mention first is when version control is turned on, it doesn't mean that every single update to your workspace will automatically be added to the version history. You actually have to choose to commit a version to the history in order to checkpoint it. So there's two ways to commit a version of a new version of a workspace. So the first way to do that is to commit while publishing. So you'll notice when we first published our workspace, we only had the new button. There was no commit button. And that's because version controls turned off on our current system. Once we turn that on, this commit button will appear. And this will allow you to add the current version or add a version of your workspace to your version history. So you can click on commit, check the box to add that to your history, and then add a little commit message saying why you're checkpointing this version of your workspace. The other way you can commit is to do so after you've published your workspace. So where this comes in useful is if you're creating a new version, you publish that up to FME Server, you'd like to be able to test it to make sure it works before you commit that version, you can do that. So you can publish without committing, test the workspace, confirm that it does exactly what you need, and then you can commit it from the repositories page in your FME server. So you'll see a commit button in there when you go to repositories from the menu. When you click on that, it'll open up a very similar dialog to what you see in Workbench, and it'll let you add a commit comment for that version. Once you have versions of a workspace committed, you can always view the full version history of a particular workspace or of all the workspaces inside a single repository. So you can do that from the repositories page in FME Server. If you click on the history button without selecting a workspace, you'll see the history for everything in the repository. Or if you just want to see the history for a specific workspace, you can select it and then click on history. What you'll see is a dialog that looks a little bit like this one. So you'll see the different versions all listed out, when they were committed, and they'll have little tags on them just to indicate what version it was. If you ever need to roll back to an older version of a workspace, you can always go to the version history, click this download button to download that older version. You'll open that inside Workbench, and then you can republish that to make that the currently active version inside FME Server. Yeah, so that's how restore works. So let's go into exercise 1.3. We're going to turn on version history, and we're going to commit a new version of the workspace we've been building. So first step is to connect to your FME server. I'll assume you're all still logged in from the last exercise. So we're going to turn on version control. So I'm just going to go straight to my server homepage so you can follow along. So if you're following along, we're on exercise 1.3 in the training manual. It's under chapter 1. So first thing we're going to do is turn on version control. So you can do that if you go to System Configuration. So you can open that up and then click on General. At the very top, we have version control, so we can click on the slider to turn that on. We'll leave everything else as it is, so we'll just leave the default values on that. So we'll leave the remote repository and token blank. So we're just switching it on so we have a local copy of version control turned on. Once that's done, we're ready to go. So first step here will be that we'd like to check in or commit the current version of our workspace because we know it works fine. So we'd like to checkpoint this so we can always roll back to it in case we need to. So let's add our current workspace to our version history. So we can do this directly in the web interface on FME Server. So we'll go to the repositories page. So that's in the left-hand side under repositories. You can click on the training repository that we created to open that up. And we'll see all the workspaces that have been published to this, which is just the one. And you'll see there's a commit button in here. So it's currently disabled because we need to select which workspace we'd like to commit. So we'll check the box next to our exercise 1 and then click on commit. So we can add a meaningful commit message. So we'll say first version of our workspace. It can give a little bit of information about what it's doing. So it's currently writing out to null. And then we can click on commit to commit that version. And you should see this successfully was committed. Now we can go back to our training repository, click that button, and we can now view the history. So you click on the history button, and you can see the history of every single version that's been committed to this repository, and it's just the one right now. We'll see it's related to our exercise 1 workspace. We'll have our commit message in bold and some information about who made this commit and when they did. So it was committed by us a few seconds ago. So you can click OK to dismiss that. So there we go. So we've successfully committed a new version of our workspace directly through the server web interface. So do a quick show of hands. Has everyone got that committed successfully? Just raise your hand if so, and you're ready to move on. Okay, looking good, fantastic. Again, if anyone had any trouble with that, just let us know through the questions panel. Or if you have any questions about anything we've covered there, exactly how that works, we're happy to help you understand if needed. So let's go down to our next exercise then. We'd now like to schedule our job to run, say once a day or as frequently as this job needs to be done. So we'll look at scheduling for this. So scheduled translations are a great way to start a workspace at a particular date or time. So you just have a workspace run automatically whenever you want it to, at the frequency that you need it to run. So you can do this from the scheduling page in FME Server. So you can click on Schedules, and you can see a list of all of the schedules that have been created. So you can see there are 2 schedules here that are created by default in FME Server. You'll see the status of both of these is that they're currently stopped. So one new thing I'll point out in FME 2019 is there's this trigger button in your schedules. So you can select a schedule and set that to trigger it once. So if you ever need to test out a workspace or have it run once with the same parameters as are set in the schedule without modifying the schedule itself, you can always set that to trigger to run it manually once. So it's a great way to test or to just trigger the job to run just to make sure everything's cleared out if you had an issue with the schedule, if it ever ran into an error or something like that. So you can create a new schedule directly from the Schedules page just by clicking on the New button. When you do that, you'll be presented with a page similar to this. So you can set up a name and a category for your schedule. So the category is useful for filtering, so it helps you just keep your schedules organized. And you can add a description for those and choose whether or not it's going to be enabled. Then you'll have your scheduling settings. You can set it up to repeat on an interval. Let me just bring it up actually. We'll be doing this in the next exercise, so don't worry about following along too much right now. Our other schedule type is a cron expression. So this just provides a more advanced way to tell FME how to run the schedule. So with the repeat on interval, you can have it run once a day. With the cron expression, for example, if you needed to run this on the 3rd Friday of every month, you could set that up. So it just gives a lot more power in how you set up the schedules. So once you've set up your schedule, you can set it up how often you want it to run. You can set up a date range, so you can have it start at a specific date in the future. You can also have the schedule automatically stop sometime in the future. Next, you can set up which workspace you'd like to run on this schedule and set values for all of its published parameters. So one thing we'll also mention is that in 2019, there are now 2 ways to schedule jobs. So you can schedule directly from the scheduling page, which is very useful for just setting up a very simple schedule. So if you have one workspace that you'd like to run regularly and not really have too much else happening with that, you can just set it up directly in here. You can also use schedules within automations. So you could set up FME Server, put in a schedule in your automation and have it, say, run 10 different jobs at the same time, or automatically send out an email to someone at a specific time. So there's lots of different things you can do with that. These schedules are very simple. It's a one-to-one relationship with the workspace, one workspace to one schedule at one time. So it just depends on how much flexibility you want in your schedule and exactly what you want to happen at that specific time. So when we look at automations, you can see what tools are available in there. So you can see if you would rather have your schedule in an automation or just keep it simple and keep it here. So let's look at exercise 1.4 and we'll look at building a schedule ourselves just to see how that process works. So I'll give you a second to open that up. So we're at exercise 1.4. So we'd like to set up our job to run every day after work. So let's create a schedule to do that. So let's go to our schedules page in the server web interface. We're going to create a new schedule. So let's create a new one. Click on the new button. So we'll just set up a test right now just to see exactly how this works. We'll call this test schedule. We can give it a category. We can name this one training. So if you want to create a new category, just type in the name and you'll see a little new beside it, and you can click on that to add it. Down below here for schedule type, we want it to be set to repeat on interval. And we'll have this repeat every 30 seconds. So we just want this to repeat frequently enough that we can see it run a few times without having to wait here for 5 days to see it trigger 5 times. So we'll say repeat every 30 seconds. We can have it start immediately, and we can set an end date. So we can have this not expire, but then we'll have this workspace run every 30 seconds for the rest of the training, which will get annoying. So we'll just say uncheck does not expire, and we'll set an end time. So you can click on the little calendar icon to say when we'd like this to stop. So we'd like this to stop today. It's Monday the 3rd, and we'll set the time. So it's currently 10:50 on these machines. So when we're logged into these machines, the time zone will match the time zone of the machine we're logged in from. So we'll have this stop, say, in about an hour. So we'll set that to 11:50. Once you've set the time, you can click OK. So we'll have this run every 30 seconds for the next hour. Next, we'd like to set up a workspace to run. So let's run our training workspace. So for repository, we'll select training. And for workspace, we'll make sure exercise 1 is selected. You'll see these publish parameters pop up by default. We can leave them at their default values. Once you're ready, you can click OK to create the schedule. And we'll see this is now listed in our schedules page with the status of enabled or started. So the next thing we could do is look at our jobs page. So I'm just going to right click on completed and open this in a new tab just to open up a new place here. And we should see that that job's run at least once automatically. There we go, twice. Perfect. And you should see, if you look in here, you'll have exercise run, 1 run once when we started our schedule and once 30 seconds later. So you can see that in the started times. You can also see under source name, the name of the schedule that submitted this job, and the source type was a schedule. So you know it was a schedule that submitted this, so you know what's running this every 30 seconds. And if I refresh this, I should see it's run again since the last time we checked. So you can always refresh to see the current jobs. Okay, so let's do another quick show of hands. Can you raise your hand if you're seeing that job running every 30 seconds? Great, that looks good. I see most people. And we'll do a second poll here. Does anyone need a few more minutes for this? Okay, great. No hands there, so we'll continue on. Looks good, perfect. So we've got this running every 30 seconds, which is great. So now we can come back and create the actual schedule. And the way we do that would be basically the same as before. So let's go to our schedules page. And really what we could do, since the schedule's finished testing, is we could come in here and modify our existing test schedule and set that to run every day. The downside to doing that is that this name will be set to test schedule forever. So you can't change the name of a schedule after you've created it. So what we could do instead is just duplicate this schedule, keep all the settings, and then make a couple changes to create our real schedule. So let's try that. So the first thing we'll do, click the checkbox beside test schedule. So it's not quite in the steps, but we're just going to test this out. So select test schedule, and we'll say duplicate. So this will create a brand new schedule with exactly the same settings as the old one, but it gives us the chance to change the name. So we can call this training schedule instead. And instead of every 30 seconds, we'll have this run once a day. And then for start time, since we want this to run after work hours, we can change the time. So I'll click on the calendar button and I'll say I'd like this to run at night. So I'll go up here, down. Okay. So we'll set this to run at 1:53 every night. So it'll run at almost 2 in the morning. And say OK. And I can change the end time to does not expire. This is going to be running once a day instead of every 30 seconds now. So we've changed our start time to run in the middle of the night, and we've changed our end time to does not expire. Once you're done, you can click OK to create the new schedule. And we should now have 2 active schedules, one set to run once a day until forever, and the other one set to run every 30 seconds for the next hour. So we could now just go in and disable our test schedule if we didn't want that to keep running. So I can select that and click disable to change the status. So there's our schedule created now. So it looks like we've got time for one more exercise here before we wrap up. So I'll just quickly cover one more concept and then we'll move on and then we'll finish this off first thing tomorrow morning. Yeah, so sharing within FME Server. So when we published our workspace, this workspace is only available to people who have permission to see this repository on FME Server. By default, when you create a new repository or add a new workspace, that repository that you create is only visible to you or to the server superuser administrator role. So if you wanted other users on your FME server to be able to see and run your job, you have to be able to share your repository with those users. So for repository sharing, you can do that from the repositories page. And you'll see these share buttons on the side. So if you're the owner or if you have permission to share items on FME server, you'll be able to see these buttons. So for example, in the training repository here, the owner is listed as admin, which is yourself, and you can click on the share with other buttons because of that. So you can choose to share your training repository with other users or with other groups of users. So it all depends on who you'd like to have access. So you can share it with all of the other FME users by choosing this group account. So you can tell by the icon here, a single user has just a one little person beside them. So that's a single user account. And the groups or roles, which would be a category of user accounts, are distinguished with these icons with 3 different people in them. So if you want to share with a group of people, you can share with the group like this. Or if you wanted to share with one specific individual, you can share directly with them from here.